11 years of forensic accounting teaches you that money is never really missing. It's just somewhere you haven't looked yet. I've sat across from CFOs who thought they'd been clever, from bookkeepers who borrowed a little, and then a little more, and once from a church treasurer who genuinely believed God would handle the reconciliation before the audit did. I don't shock easy. I don't rattle. And I certainly don't sleep through a fraud happening 12 feet below my bedroom floor. That's what I told myself the morning after my brother-in-law helped himself to my corporate card on a Wednesday in October, while I was home, while the house was quiet, while I trusted the person I'd let into my life. By Thursday, $600 was gone, car parts, a gaming setup, and 2 months of prepaid storage unit fees. And the only thing standing between my family and a very ugly truth was a card my brother-in-law didn't know existed. Let me back up. My name is Leah. I'm 32. I've been with my firm, Hartwell and Crane Forensic Accounting in Nashville, since I was 21 and still carrying a backpack to client meetings. I make my living finding the things people hide inside columns of numbers. Carter, my husband, 34, HVAC technician, laughs at my jokes even when they're bad, married me 2 springs ago in a ceremony so small his aunt complained the whole weekend. We bought a house on the east side of town that fall. A craftsman bungalow with a deep porch and a kitchen that needed everything. I loved it immediately and completely. Carter's older brother, Preston, lost his logistics job in March. By August, his landlord had filed the paperwork. He called Carter on a Sunday voice, pitched the way you pitch something you know is a hard sell, and said he just needed somewhere for to land until he found something new. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Carter asked me on a Tuesday, standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee, not quite meeting my eyes. Preston had a son, 11 years old. His name was Tommy, and he had this way of dragging his feet when he walked, like every hallway was longer than it needed to be. You don't say no to the kid. So Preston took the spare room, Tommy took the pullout in the study, and my quiet house started operating at a different frequency. Louder. More complicated. Carter seemed simultaneously relieved and braced, the way you are when something you've been dreading is finally just happening. Week 2, $40 disappeared from the bowl on the entryway table where Carter kept his cash. I noticed because I notice things. I told Carter quietly, at dinner, after Tommy had gone back to the study. Carter rubbed the back of his neck and said, "You sure you didn't move it?" I hadn't. He knew I hadn't. But something shifted in his face, some shutter coming down, and I didn't push. I wrote it in my work notebook instead. I document everything. It's not obsession. It's habit. 11 years of habit. I started keeping my laptop bag in our bedroom. I moved the good jewelry. I told Carter that the guest card reader, by the front door, should probably be put away. He agreed without looking at me. What I didn't do was move my work tote off the hook in the mudroom. It was a leather bag I'd carried for 6 years. It hung where it always hung because I leave the house at 6:45 in the morning and I need to grab it without thinking. Because some part of me still believed that the mudroom, 12 feet from where Preston slept, was safe territory. I should have known better. I did know better. I just hadn't decided to act like it yet. The second Wednesday of October, I worked from home. I was deep in a client file by early afternoon, upstairs at the desk, headphones in. Carter was on a job in Brentwood. Preston had said something at breakfast about errands. Tommy was at school. The house was quiet for almost 2 hours. I didn't hear anything. That's the part I keep turning over. I didn't hear footsteps. Didn't hear the mudroom door, didn't hear the particular silence that means someone in your house is being careful. I just sat with my spreadsheets until 4 o'clock, went downstairs for coffee, grabbed my tote off its hook to find my phone charger, and noticed nothing. The alert started at 4:47. I was still in the kitchen when my phone buzzed. Then again. Then a third time with that particular subject line my bank uses when something is moving. I looked at the screen and went very still. 4:21 p.m. Auto parts. Ford online. 4:29 p.m. Electronics retailer. Gaming console, headset, 2 controllers, 8 and 9 need. In-store pickup, 1 mile from our house. 4:38 p.m. Storage company, prepaid rental, 8 months. 1,003. 3 more by 4:50. Different merchants, same afternoon, same location data pulling off our home Wi-Fi. $8,600 in 29 minutes. Moving with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they needed and had been thinking about it for a while. I sat down at the kitchen table. Here is what I want to tell you about that moment, because people picture rage and rage came eventually. What came first was recognition. The same recognition I feel when a set of numbers finally tells me its secret. The cold click of a thing falling into place. I called the fraud line before I finished my coffee, locked both cards, disputed the charges, asked for the purchase details the way I ask clients for documentation, slowly, specifically, twice. Both cards. That's the part I need you to understand. Because I didn't explain it clearly enough to Carter that night. And I certainly didn't explain it to Nadine. And the not explaining is what made everything that came next possible. I carry 2 cards in the same wallet pocket, my personal debit card on the left, my firm's corporate Amex on the right. The Amex is the one I use most: client dinners, travel, supply purchases. It lives in the outside slot. In the mudroom, moving fast, working out of a bag that wasn't his, Preston hadn't taken my debit card. He'd taken the one that was easier to reach, the one in front. He'd taken the card that belonged to Hartwell and Crane. I knew this before I confirmed it, because I know my own wallet. But I sat with my phone and waited for the fraud rep to read me the card number, and when she did, the last 4 digits weren't mine, they were the firm's. Here is what that means, because Nadine didn't understand it, and neither did Carter at first, and their not understanding it is where everything went sideways. A corporate Amex issued by an accounting firm has its own compliance rules. Unauthorized use flags the card to the firm's financial controller within 24 hours, which it did the following morning when my office manager Claudia called my cell at 8:15 and asked if I'd authorized a transaction from my home address on a Wednesday afternoon. The firm had already flagged it to their bank. The bank had already started processing. There was no version of this where I decided to be gracious and let it go. I found Preston that Wednesday evening in the kitchen, reheating something, moving around my stove the way he'd moved around everything in my house for 8 weeks. Easy, proprietorial, like an arrangement he'd negotiated long before I was involved. I put my phone on the counter, with the transaction list facing up. "We need to talk about this afternoon," I said. He looked at the screen, his face rearranged, not fell, rearranged. He said, "Someone get your info?" "That happens. My buddy had his whole account wiped last year." I told him the electronics pickup was captured on in-store camera, that the storage unit was registered in his name, prepaid from my card. "I borrowed it," he said. "I was going to pay you back. It was an emergency." He said it the way you say something you've said before, something that has worked before. Flat and certain, like a statement about weather. I told him the card he'd used didn't belong to me. He didn't understand that yet. Most people don't, right away. I got Carter on the phone and told him to come home. He arrived gray-faced and quiet, and when I laid out what I knew at the kitchen table, he did the thing I should have seen coming. He called his mother. Nadine arrived within the hour. She's 63, retired school principal, drives a Buick she keeps spotlessly clean, and she walked into my kitchen like she'd been asked to chair a meeting. She sat down across from me, folded her hands, and listened for approximately 90 seconds before she said, "He wouldn't do this on purpose, Leah. You know that. He gets confused about money." Not, "I'm so sorry," not, "let me see the documentation." He gets confused about money. Like the $8,600 was a rounding error. Preston was standing in the doorway. He looked at his mother the way someone looks at an exit sign. Nadine's voice went warm then, which was worse than if she'd been sharp. She said, "Whatever this was, We handle it in family. You don't need to involve your office. You don't need to make calls. You cancel whatever needs canceling. We sit down and we figure it out together. That's what we do. I watched Carter at that table. He sat in the middle, not next to me, not next to his mother. Precisely equidistant, like a man trying to be in two countries at once. He was 34 years old, and he sat with his shoulders up around his ears like a kid called to the principal's office. I had never seen my husband sit like that. I said, as evenly as I could, that the bank was already involved, that the firm had already been notified, that this was simply what happens when you use a regulated corporate instrument without authorization, the way you call the fire department when the curtains are burning. Nadine's jaw moved once. Something crossed her face, not guilt, betrayal, like I had reached into a pocket that wasn't mine. You called them, she said quiet, before you talked to us. And there it was. In her arithmetic, the theft was weather. But my phone call was a choice, and choices have owners, and I was the only owner in the room she hadn't already decided to protect. Preston let out a slow breath. The machine had run its cycle and found in his favor. What none of them understood yet was what I understood, sitting at my own kitchen table that night. The card he'd used didn't answer to any of us. Hartwell and Crane had already filed with their bank. Their bank had 30 days to refer the file to the appropriate desk. At $8,600, that desk was a felony desk, and there was a line on the firm's affidavit form that read, I, the undersigned, affirm that the above transactions were not authorized by me. Failure to sign within 15 business days constitutes implied authorization, which carries its own set of consequences for a licensed CPA. I had 15 days, and exactly 0 legal power to skip them. I told Carter all of this that night after Nadine left, with Tommy's cartoon murmuring through the wall and Preston very quiet down the hall. I watched my husband process it about half a beat slower than he should have, because half his mind was already somewhere else, already at his mother's kitchen table, bracing. Can't we just tell them it was a mistake, he said, that you handled it internally? I told him what my managing partner had told me when I started. The corporate card exists because clients trust us with their money. If I misrepresent a transaction on that card, I don't just lose my job. I lose my license. And a false statement to a federally regulated financial institution has its own name in the legal code and its own consequences. Carter put his face in his hands. Down the hall, I heard Preston's television go on. The family came in waves after that, the way weather systems stack up. Nadine called Carter every morning. His aunt texted me directly to say she was praying for peace in this season of conflict, which is church speak, for we've heard and we've already decided. Preston's old roommate, who'd met me twice at a barbecue, sent Carter a long message about loyalty. Nobody called Preston, nobody sat down across from him and asked why. I want you to sit with that. In 5 weeks, as far as I could ever learn, not one person in that family picked up the phone and asked the man who actually took the card to account for what he'd done. The calls all came to me, because in their physics I was the moving part. Preston spending $8,600 from my bag while I was upstairs working was like weather, unfortunate, impersonal, nobody's fault particularly. Me filing with the bank was a decision, and decisions have owners. Sunday dinner at Nadine's that week was roast chicken and performance. She said grace and added something at the end about the family that Evelyn had built. Evelyn was Carter's grandmother, 5 years gone, and she set that good woman's memory on the table like a piece of paper she wanted me to sign. I sat at the corner of that table, by the serving counter where I'd sat for 2 years, and I recognized the move. When the facts are against you, change the question to loyalty. Everyone passed the rolls and looked at me like I was the one holding the knife. I went to the records because that is what I do. 2 lunch hours, public databases. Preston had 2 prior evictions, 2020 and 2022, both resolved. Payer listed on the second one, Nadine. 3 small civil judgments, all settled quietly. And one I had to dig for, A workplace incident at a shipping company 4 years back, an inventory discrepancy, restitution made, no charges filed at the employer's request. I sat in my car in the firm's parking garage and looked at the shape of it. This wasn't a desperate one-time thing. This was a system, old and well-maintained, running on the fuel of a mother who believed that catching her son's falls was the same as loving him. My $8,600 wasn't a crisis, it was a subscription renewal. Carter told me about the truck the same night I found those records. We were in bed, lights off, his voice coming out of the dark the way confessions do. When Carter was 19, he'd saved $3,200 over 2 years working weekends, specifically to buy a used pickup so he could start taking HVAC apprenticeship jobs without borrowing Nadine's car. He had the cash in an envelope in his dresser drawer. Preston was 24 that year, had just gotten a second speeding ticket, and lost his license for 6 months. Nadine asked Carter if Preston could borrow the truck money for a bus pass and a fine and a few months of expenses. Carter said yes. He was 19 and she was his mother, and the word borrow was in the sentence. The money came back in small pieces over 3 years. Never all of it. Carter was 25 before he had his own truck. He'd never told me that part. I told myself that's just what you do for family, he said to the ceiling. You cover. He was quiet a long while. I've been covering since I was 19. I held his hand in the dark and didn't say anything, because some things need a minute before they need a response. Nadine came to our house on a Thursday with a casserole and an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $8,600 and a typed page, a statement addressed to the firm, declaring the card use had been authorized by me, that the purchases were known to me, that no crime had occurred. There was a line for my signature. She'd had a notary sign off on the template. She'd thought it through. That was somehow the worst part. Every cent, she said, setting the check on my kitchen table with both hands. He'll pay me back if it takes 5 years. You sign that paper, your office closes it, and we put this behind us. I told her the truth plainly. The money wasn't mine to accept. The card belonged to the firm. The victim on paper was a business and a bank, and I couldn't sign a backward authorization on something that had never been authorized. A false affidavit to a federally insured institution is its own charge with its own name. Nadine looked at me the way people look at a calculator that produced an impossible number. She pushed the envelope closer. Tell your firm you gave him permission. Keep it simple. She genuinely could not hear it. In 63 years, no truth in her life had ever stood longer than family agreement. She had simply never met a fact that couldn't be outvoiced. I slid the check back across the table and watched her hand close around it slowly. I understood in that moment I hadn't refused money. I'd refused a citizenship. The firm's legal counsel walked me through it in a conference room 2 days later. If I signed the firm's affidavit of unauthorized use, it would trigger a referral to the district attorney's office. At $8,600, Preston would be facing a felony charge. First offense, likely diversion with decent representation. But a charge with his name on a docket, which was, in this family, the one weather event no system had ever learned to handle. If I signed Nadine's document instead, 3 things happened. The corporate misuse became my personal liability. My CPA license went before the state board with the word falsification attached. And as counsel said, without drama, a false sworn statement to a federally regulated bank is itself a federal offense. One of these papers puts your brother-in-law in front of a judge, he said. The other one could put you there. I drove home the long way that evening, past the Cumberland River, through the part of East Nashville where the old houses are being carefully rebuilt. I thought about Nadine believing she was protecting her son. I thought about Carter at 19, handing over the truck money, telling himself that's just what family does. I thought about myself at 20, taking out loans to finish school, because one summer my mother had used my savings account to cover a car payment and called it a short-term borrow. I thought about the things she said afterward. You're such a good girl, you never make things harder. That was the wage, not thank you, not I'll fix this, you never make things harder. And here is the part I haven't told anyone out loud until now. On a Thursday night, with the affidavit on one side of my kitchen table, and Nadine's unsigned statement on the other, I was going to sign the wrong one. I'd built a beautiful case for it. Sign, and Carter stops looking like a man standing between two fires. Sign, and Tommy gets to stay through the school semester without his father's life going sideways. Sign, and Sunday dinner goes back to being just dinner. All it cost was one line, and a version of events I'd spent 11 years being the person who doesn't write. My hand was 2 inches from Nadine's paper when the back door opened. Tommy, 11 years old, hair sticking up on one side, socks on the wrong feet. He'd been staying over while Preston dealt with some stuff, and he'd gotten up for water, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the papers spread across my table with that radar children have. He said, "Is my dad in trouble because of me?" I heard myself answer before I'd decided to speak. Certain, immediate, the way you are with children when the truth is the only useful thing. Nobody. Grown-ups are in trouble because of grown-up choices. I got him his water. I walked him back to the pullout. I tucked the blanket around his feet. And then I stood alone in the hallway, listening to my own voice hang in the air, because I had just told that boy in one sentence, in the dark, without thinking, the exact truth I had been negotiating away from for 2 weeks. Grown-ups are in trouble because of grown-up choices, not because of the people who document them, not because of the people who refuse to sign. The dinner was Nadine's idea. She called it a family conversation, set it for Sunday, made sure Pastor Willis from her church could join. I knew what it was before Carter finished reading the text. It was a hearing, and she had chosen the venue, the witnesses, and the referee. Carter asked me what I was going to do. I told him I was going to tell the truth one time, out loud, in the room where the lying had been getting done for 20 years. What happened after that was up to everyone else. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask which paper was in my bag. I loved him for that. Nadine's dining room was arranged like a staged photograph. 8 people. Her sister, Carter's cousin from Clarksville, the neighbor couple she'd known for 30 years, and Pastor Willis at Nadine's right hand, pen already in his hand. The good dishes were out. There were flowers from her garden on the table. The kind of detail that says, "This matters," without specifying what kind of matters. My place card, she'd made place cards, was directly to her left. For 2 years I'd sat at the end near the serving counter. The week she needed my signature, I'd been promoted. Preston sat across from me and studied his water glass. Nadine stood when everyone was seated and spoke warmly, about family being the only institution that matters, about mercy being the language of love, about the world being full of cold systems that don't understand what we protect when we protect each other. It was a good speech. She'd been giving versions of it for decades. Then she looked at me, soft and certain, and called me her daughter for the first time. The word dropped into the room like a coin into a collection plate. "All it takes is a signature," she said, "and this family goes back to being a family." Pastor Willis slid his pen across the table toward me. I opened my bag. Nadine exhaled. What I put on the table was not her paper. It was the firm's affidavit, folded in 3, and beside it, my own pen, the one my father left me, small dent in the clip from where he used to tap it against his desk while he thought. I looked around the table, 8 people waiting to watch me fold. I said, "Before anyone eats, I need to say a few true things, once. Nobody has to respond." I looked at Nadine. I said, "I know why you do this." Carter told me about the truck money. And before that there was the fine, and before that there was the apartment, and before that there was something else I don't know about yet. Because there's always something else. You have spent 30 years making sure Preston never once had to look at a consequence long enough to learn anything from it, and I understand the love in it. I do. But look at what it bought. Your older son is 41 years old, and he walked through my mudroom and took $8,100 from a bag that wasn't his, and spent it in 29 minutes and called it borrowing. He wasn't even afraid afterward. He reheated dinner. He said, "Someone probably got your information." He sat at my table and said it with the exact confidence of a man who has never once in his adult life been left alone with the thing he did. That's not protection, that's a debt with everyone's name on it but his. I looked at Carter then, and only Carter. I said, "You saved $3,200 when you were 19 and handed it over because she asked, and I know you called it love. I know that's what it felt like. But I need you to hear this. One time, you were 25 before you had your own truck, and I don't think you've ever said that out loud to anyone." Carter's jaw moved once. His eyes were very still. I said, "I can't sign this paper. I wanted a seat at this table. I want you to know that. I wanted it more than any of you ever noticed. But the card your son used doesn't belong to me, and the truth about it was never mine to trade. Not for a check, and not for a seat. The truth doesn't need my permission to be true." And in front of 8 people, on Nadine's white tablecloth, I signed the affidavit with my father's pen and dated it in full. The room went very quiet. Not a gasp. Something quieter than that, and worse. The sound of a group of people all making the same decision at once. Nadine rose. Her hands were shaking faintly, and I noticed, because ice and is thing. "You were never going to be family," she said, and her voice cracked slightly in the middle of it. "I think you always knew that." Preston stood without a word and moved toward the door. His cousin followed. Pastor Willis tucked his pen away quietly, like an umpire putting away a card that wasn't needed after all. I folded the affidavit, capped my father's pen, and walked out of that dining room past the sideboard, past the doorway to the kitchen, where Nadine had made me coffee the first time I'd visited, 2.5 years ago, when I was still figuring out where she kept the napkins. Behind me I heard one chair scrape back. Carter said to the room and to no one, "I'll get the car." It was raining on the way home, the soft kind that doesn't announce itself. Carter drove and neither of us touched the radio for a long time. We were most of the way down Gallatin Avenue when he spoke to the windshield. 34 years, he said, and the only story I ever knew how to tell about my family was the one they handed me. He stopped at a red light. The wipers went slow and even. "You're the first person who ever asked me if I wanted to write a different one." I started crying then. Not the way I'd braced for, nothing cinematic, just quietly, like something that had been waiting for permission. 5 weeks of it, maybe 32 years of it. The version of myself who learned early that being good meant not making things harder for anyone else. Carter reached over and held my hand. He held it through every red light the rest of the way home. "Here is how it settled, because you've stayed this long and you've earned the accounting." Preston moved his boxes out of our house the following week. The DA's office offered diversion. He acknowledged responsibility in writing, entered a restitution plan for the full amount, completed 80 hours of community service. No conviction on his record if he finishes it. The firm was made whole by their bank. My license review closed with no finding. Claudia framed the clearance letter and put it on the break room bulletin board, because Claudia is exactly that kind of person. Tommy still comes by on weekends sometimes. He brings his Switch and sits at our kitchen table and eats whatever I'm cooking and talks to Carter about baseball, like nothing has fundamentally shifted, because for him, the love was always real, and real love doesn't have to forward the bill. Preston called me in February. Left a voicemail, 9 seconds. He said he was sorry and that he understood if I deleted it. I listened to it 3 times. I didn't delete it, and I didn't call back, not yet. But I saved it, because it was the most honest 9 seconds he'd ever given me. And I've learned to keep the true things. Nadine sends Carter a card at Christmas, addressed only to him. He sets it on the counter and doesn't say anything about it, and I don't ask. We are working out, slowly and without a map, what a marriage looks like when one person stops covering and the other one finally notices what they'd been paying. Carter started keeping a legal pad on his desk. He told me it was for job estimates. I looked at it once when he left it open, just a plain yellow pad, nothing dramatic. But there was a line at the top in his handwriting. What I own, what I chose, what I was told to carry. I left it there and didn't say a word about it. My bag still hangs on the mudroom hook. I leave for work at 6:45 in the morning, and I need to grab it without thinking, and the hook is where it goes. I sleep the whole night through now. Some evenings, heading upstairs to bed, I stop and look at that bag in the dark. Just a leather tote on a hook in a quiet house. You'd never know it once held the most expensive decision I almost didn't make. I used to believe that keeping the peace meant staying small enough that no one had to rearrange their life around my existence. I know better now. The kindest thing I ever did for that family was stop pretending a half-truth was the same as a home. If something in this story sat somewhere familiar, if you've ever been handed a pen and told to just make it easier, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've been carrying something that was never yours to carry in the first place, I hope something in here gives you permission to finally set it down. Subscribe to Peaceful Drama Stories, share this with someone who needs it, and I'll see you in the next one.